Okay, so there's a few subjects I want to cover in this video, so please bear with me. I've just watched this film. It's a Spanish language film, Miss Bala, the Bullet Queen, that's the English title. Um, it's a 2011 film, and it's basically about Mexican drug war. Um, Without giving everything away, it's about a young woman who is entering the Baja California beauty contest, and basically she ends up as a drug mule for a cartel. I think the cartel is fictional, it's not one I recognise, but presumably it's supposed to be based on the Sinaloa cartel, or one of the other big cartels, or at least an offshoot of one of them. And the film is partially based on the true story of a girl with the same name, also called Laura, I forget her family name, who was involved in a scandal in 2008. She was also a beauty queen, and she ended up as a mule for a drug gang. I don't really want to make this video a very, very academic, in and out sort of talk about the drug war, because I believe it's a very, very complex situation, and I don't know all the facts, so I'm going to try not to weigh in too heavily to it. But one thing is clear, that is that this has been a very costly war, in terms of human life and also in terms of Mexico's economic development. But in terms of human life, it actually now ranks as the second deadliest conflict of the 2010s. And this is something I have studied. So after the Syrian civil war, this is the deadliest conflict of this decade in terms of lives lost. Well over 100,000 by now. When the film was made, at the end it says over 36,000 people have been killed in Mexico's drug war. The figure is now well over 100,000, and no one knows for sure. When President Peña Nieto came to power, he of course promised a lot of reforms, and I imagine that safety was one of the big things. This is a cover from Time magazine from the beginning of last year. A somewhat controversial cover, I should say, because a lot of Mexicans found it somewhat they made a lot of satire on this. I guess the idea was that his political party, the PRI, which had dominated Mexico for 70 years, had not done enough to end drug violence, and had arguably fueled it. Like I said, I'm not going to get into the ins and outs, but clearly there's a lot of people in Mexico who are very skeptical about Peña Nieto. He's young, he's good looking, he's got film star looks, so he's sort of like, I think he sort of campaigned like a Mexican Kennedy, something like that. But certainly the drug war hasn't ended since his time in power. He came to power in 2012. The drug war was launched under his predecessor, Fidel Calderon. Actually, the first signs, I think, were in the years of Vicente Fox. But when we talk about this drug war, it doesn't mean that drug violence didn't exist in Mexico before this. Of course it did. But, you know, I remember around 2010, 2011, when this was really, really bad, and it was just thousands of people being killed a year. Anyway, I don't want to talk entirely about the Mexico drug war. I want to talk about a more specific issue, which is the issues raised in the film. So basically, this young woman is a beauty contestant, and she goes to a nightclub with a friend, and they get caught up in basically what looks like a shootout. What I will say before I continue talking about the synopsis of this is it is a film, and no film should be seen as absolute fact. So although this is based on a real case, that doesn't mean it's fact for fact. You know, it doesn't mean there's bound to be artistic license in it, and I know a few people have condemned the film for being inaccurate. Others have praised it for being a good film. I think it's a good film, but I don't know enough about the facts to say it's true or not. But I do think it's sort of a gateway, a window, if you like, onto some of the issues. And if you haven't seen it and you're interested in the subject, I do recommend it. Miss Bala. I think that's a mistake. I think it should be Miss Baya. I'm not sure why it uses the L as opposed to J. The director is Gerardo Nareño. So yeah, basically she finds herself becoming a drug mule, and this violent drug gang basically uses her for all their dirty deeds, whether it be transporting bodies in a van, whether it be tying drug money to herself. There's one scene where she goes to the US border and there's a dodgy character on the other side that searches her. There's one scene where the police or DEA find her and pin her down, and then after taking her forward just let her go. The police officer who does that, or the DEA officer who does that, ends up basically lynched, executed, and then hung from a bridge. So it's quite a brutal film, as you would expect. And throughout the film, she's basically just used as a pawn. She comes across as a very frightened and vulnerable young woman who is doing what she's doing because she has no other choice. They threaten her family, they threaten her. She's raped at one point. It's a very disturbing film in that sense, but I think it's a good film insofar as bringing about awareness of the issues. I'm sure it's not the only film about the Mexico drug war. But anyway, in the end, the DEA capture the gang, and she's presented to the media as part of the gang. And that point made me, like I say, it's not, the film shouldn't be taken as hardcore fact, but it did make me think about some issues. Certainly in terms of the film, it's very hard not to feel a lot of sympathy for her, because everything she does, she basically has no choice. And you hear this sort of beauty pageant CEO woman, I guess you'd call her, or organizer and manager. Oh, that's another factor, by the way. The beauty contest is rigged. She becomes Miss Baja California despite her performance, because the drug cartel fixes that up so that she will do their dirty deeds for them. And again, that relates to the 2008 scandal. And the sort of beauty queen president, presumably she's threatened by the drug cartel as well. It doesn't show that, but in the end you can kind of hear her on the radio saying that her actions, the actions of girls like her, are a disgrace for Mexico. But this made me think of the issue of drug mules versus drug barons and drug gangs. There's a lot of things said when we talk about drug trafficking, not just in Central America, which is obviously a huge problem there, but also in Southeast Asia. And I think that one thing that is often said is that anyone involved in drugs must be a scumbag, they deserve everything they get, they're a bad person, etc. The problem with that analogy is it overlooks situations like this. There have been many examples of innocent civilians being caught up in the Mexico drug war. There's been thousands of civilian deaths. Most recently, those students that have gone missing. And it caught my attention recently that President Pena Nieto was visiting London. He was making a state visit. This is our year of the UK and Mexico and the UK. Usually when there's state visits here, I check out the embassy of the country where, just to see what sort of information there is. And on the Mexican embassy webpage in the UK, there's actually an entire section on human rights, which contradicts the claim that protesters were making outside Buckingham Palace, where Pena Nieto was visiting. That Mexico is one of the world's worst human rights violators. I'm not going to say I know all the facts, but I could believe that, because this war has been very brutal, and I think it's a little bit like Nigeria, whereby civilians have got caught up between the Nigerian army and Boko Haram. I think in Mexico, civilians have been caught up between Mexican law enforcement and the drug cartels. And it's quite clear that a lot of the law enforcement is just as corrupt and brutal as the cartels are. Just to be clear, I don't regard drug cartels as Robin Hood type figures. I think they're criminal scumbags. And I think the likes of El Chapo, Guzman, he was a drug kingpin of the Sinaloa cartel, I think they get everything they deserve. Like I said, I'm against the death penalty, but there's certain people in this world it's very difficult to feel any sympathy for. And in the film, actually, shows one of these drug lords, probably not a boss, but one of the foot soldiers, I guess, and just using this girl like a piece of meat, basically. It's disgusting, and Any man that treats a woman like that is a piece of shit, as far as I'm concerned. So I've no doubt there are people involved in the drug trade that are the scum of the earth, and they bring nothing but misery to Mexico. But it wouldn't be so straightforward to just say that all the drug cartels are bad guys and that's it, because, like I say, the issues are very complex, and I'm not going to weigh too much into them in this video. But what I do want to get out there is that there are innocent people caught up in this, and sometimes they have no choice but to be mules. So that's why I get quite let's say I'm quite interested in cases in Asia, because I think on some occasions there are people who are caught up as drug mules and they really don't have much of a choice. There was a high profile case in Indonesia recently, which differs somewhat from the two guys on death row now. They were drug barons, and they weren't mules. Those guys were drug dealers, and they haven't even denied it. No one doubts their guilt. Okay, there's a death penalty debate, but there was a British grandmother, Lindsay Sandiford. I've heard mixed things. I've heard some people say that she was an experienced drug carrier, but her testimony is that drug gangs threatened her family if she didn't do it. I'm quite sceptical of that claim, because if that was the case, she could have went to the police in the UK and reported them in the UK, rather than going the whole way to a country which is known for taking a very hard line on drug offences, as every Southeast Asian country is. And that's one big difference between the Mexico situation and the situation in Southeast Asia. Mexico doesn't have the death penalty, those countries do. So if Mexico suddenly had the death penalty, would it reduce drug violence? Would it reduce the drug trade? I really don't know. It certainly hasn't stopped it in Southeast Asia, although in terms of volume I don't know which region is higher, but it certainly doesn't stop it in that region. I do think one of Mexico's biggest problems, and this is as an outsider not knowing all the facts, my impression is there is a big problem of corruption, whereby frankly a lot of the police are in the pocket of the cartels. Some of these cartels are incredibly powerful, and if you're a low-ranking police officer, maybe your pay isn't wonderful. It's very conceivable that there will be a lot of corruption and officers working for the cartels rather than protecting the Mexican people, which is what they should be doing. So if I was Peña Nieto, one of my biggest priorities would be having a massive anti-corruption campaign against the police. Also, cleaning up their behaviour, because when you have a situation whereby law enforcement acts just like the criminals, i.e. Perhaps involved in torturing people and things like that, then the situation is never going to end, because it's going to breed anger and it's going to let down the public. I mean, in the end of this film it shows the police roughing her up, and it's just really hard to watch, but it's a good film. So anyway, let me know your thoughts. Do you think that governments need to see, and by governments I'm talking about legislation, do you think it needs to differentiate between drug mules and drug lords? Which by the way, that's staunchly my position. I think many drug mules have no other choice. Although it would be naive of me to say that they are all just innocent victims. I think some of them are motivated by greed and no damn, like they're doing it because they are part of the gang. But I do believe there are many cases out there like this young woman, and okay, this is just a film, but it's based on some things that are really going on. So it is an eye opener. I've seen it before actually, but I just thought I'd commented on it this time. It was an official Oscar entry, by the way, for 2012. This is the film once again, Miss Baya. Let me know your thoughts. I'm not talking here about the rights and wrongs of the death penalty, that's for another video. I'm not talking about all the issues of the drug war. I'm talking specifically about should drug mules be treated much more leniently than drug lords. In fact, should drug mules be treated as victims? if they have no other choice. In my opinion, if it is a case like is portrayed in the film, they should be seen entirely as victims and not be charged at all, because legislation needs to recognise that they had no other choice. They potentially have no other choice, and if it's a case of being shot or tortured or carrying drugs, most people would choose to carry drugs. It's an awful choice to make, because you know the consequences, serving a very long time in jail. But if it's that or something fatal, I think most people would choose the latter. I mean the former. So do let me know your thoughts. It's an eye-opening film. And by the way, this is something I would say that makes me uncomfortable about the situation in Southeast Asian countries. The approach there seems to be that if you're in any way involved in drugs, you get the death penalty. They don't seem to have any differentiation between a powerful drug lord and a low-level mule, which I think is disgraceful. I really don't have a great deal of sympathy for powerful drug lords who don't give a damn who they hurt. And these are guys, and sometimes women, who are prepared to hurt civilians. As far as I'm concerned, they're the scum of the earth. I've no sympathy with them. But I do have a lot of sympathy for, say, for example, a poor farmer or a vulnerable young woman who is forced to do this because they have no other choice. So I do think it's very important that these issues are raised. Let me know your thoughts. Thank you.